You don't belong in first class." The words landed with the cold certainty of a verdict before Marcus Ellington had even reached seat 2A. Conversations faded across the premium cabin as heads slowly turned toward the tall black man, wearing a plain charcoal t-shirt, dark jeans, and worn white sneakers. He stopped for only a second, his calm expression never changing, while flight attendant Nicole Barrett folded her arms across her Navy uniform and blocked the aisle as though she had rehearsed this exact moment 100 times before. The cabin lights glowed softly above polished leather seats. Fresh coffee drifted through the air, and outside the wide windows of Chicago O'Hare International Airport, the late afternoon sun reflected across the silver wing of Skyline Airways Flight 217 bound for San Francisco. Every detail whispered luxury. Every stare whispered doubt. Marcus glanced down at the boarding pass resting neatly between his fingers before looking back at Nicole with quiet patience. "My seat is 2A, he said in an even voice. She barely looked at the ticket. "Sir, passengers in this cabin usually know where they're supposed to be." A few people chuckled under their breath. A man wearing an expensive navy suit adjusted his cufflinks and smiled toward his wife as if the outcome had already been decided. Another passenger muttered just loudly enough for nearby rows to hear. "Looks like somebody wandered into the wrong section." Marcus didn't respond. He had heard versions of those words before. 25 years earlier, when he walked into his first investor meeting carrying blueprints instead of prestige, someone had asked whether he was delivering lunch instead of leading the presentation. Years later, after building companies worth billions, the words changed, but the assumptions never truly disappeared. They simply learned better manners. Nicole reached forward and took the boarding pass from his hand without asking. She studied it for barely a second before shaking her head. "This can't be right." She tapped her tablet, frowned dramatically, then sighed. "Looks like there's been a seating issue. You'll need to move to economy." Marcus remained exactly where he was. His shoulders stayed relaxed, his breathing steady, his eyes focused not on winning an argument, but on understanding the people standing in front of him. Around him, phones slowly appeared above armrests. A young college student near row 3 discreetly opened a camera app. An older woman across the aisle whispered to her husband, "He hasn't done anything." The captain's welcome announcement echoed faintly through the speakers, almost drowned out by the growing tension spreading through the cabin like an approaching storm. Nicole's smile disappeared. "Sir, if you refuse to cooperate, security will escort you off this aircraft." Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying her expression more than her words. There was no anger in his face, only disappointment, as though he had hoped this flight would prove something different. Instead, it was becoming another test. He slowly reached into his pocket, removed his phone, unlocked the screen, and glanced once at the name waiting at the top of his contacts. He didn't press it. Not yet. Outside, baggage crews continued loading luggage beneath the aircraft while fuel trucks rolled away from the gate. Inside, no one realized that within the next hour, one decision made in this aisle would ripple far beyond a single flight, reaching control towers, executive boardrooms, financial markets, and every departure board carrying the Skyline Airways logo across the country. But at that moment, all anyone saw was a quiet black passenger standing beside seat 2, while an entire cabin silently decided whether dignity belonged in first class. Marcus Ellington slipped the phone back into his pocket without making the call, not because he doubted what would happen, but because moments like these always revealed more before they reached their conclusion. He had learned long ago that people rarely showed their character when everything was comfortable. They showed it when they believed someone beneath them had no power to respond. Nicole Barrett glanced toward the boarding door where another flight attendant, Brian Collins, had just stepped inside carrying a tablet. She waved him over with quiet confidence. "This passenger insists that seat 2 Alpha belongs to him," she said. Brian looked Marcus up and down before offering a polite smile that somehow felt colder than open hostility. "Sir, we can avoid delaying everyone if you simply move to economy." Marcus looked directly at him. "My boarding pass says otherwise." Brian accepted the paper from Nicole, barely scanning it before handing it back. "Sometimes the system makes mistakes." Marcus nodded once. Systems usually do exactly what people tell them to do. The remark lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Several nearby passengers exchanged uncertain glances. Across the aisle, An elderly woman folded the magazine in her lap. She had watched enough years pass to recognize the difference between arrogance and quiet confidence. Marcus carried the second one effortlessly. His posture never changed. His voice never rose. Even standing in the middle of the aisle while strangers silently judged him, he appeared more comfortable than anyone wearing a tailored suit around him. It was almost as though he belonged exactly where he was because he knew something no one else did. Brian tapped his tablet again before frowning. "There is no executive boarding notation attached to your reservation." Marcus answered calmly. "Look again." Brian sighed with visible impatience but did not repeat the search. Instead, he locked the screen and looked toward Nicole. That tiny decision did not escape Marcus. Neither did the whisper from the businessman seated in row 1. People always think rules do not apply to them. Marcus almost smiled. Rules had built his career. Shortcuts had destroyed the competitors who underestimated patience. More than 2 decades earlier, he had spent nights sleeping inside a borrowed office after banks rejected every loan application he submitted. Investors dismissed him before he finished introductions. Hotel clerks questioned whether his credit cards belonged to him. Restaurant hosts suggested there might be more comfortable places nearby. Every experience became another brick in a foundation that eventually carried thousands of employees, hundreds of contracts, and companies spread across multiple continents. Success had changed his address, his balance sheets, and the headlines written about him. It had never completely changed the assumptions made within the first 5 seconds of entering a room. A young woman wearing a trainee flight attendant badge stepped cautiously into the aisle carrying bottled water. Her name tag read Emily Carter. She looked from Marcus to the boarding pass still resting in his hand, then toward Brian's tablet. Confusion crossed her face before she quietly asked, "Did the gate system rescan his ticket?" Nicole answered before Brian could speak. "That is not your concern." Emily hesitated only briefly. "I thought I remembered seeing his reservation during pre-boarding." Nicole's expression hardened. "Focus on your assigned duties." Emily lowered her eyes, but the uncertainty remained. Marcus noticed it immediately. Someone had started asking questions, and questions had a way of traveling farther than accusations. Around them, passengers who had been pretending not to watch were no longer hiding their attention. Even the steady rhythm of boarding had slowed as more travelers paused near the entrance, sensing that something far more important than a seating assignment was quietly unfolding inside the first-class cabin. The atmosphere inside the cabin shifted almost imperceptibly, like pressure building before a storm that no weather forecast had predicted. Brian Collins stepped into the aisle and pressed the call button near the galley. Less than a minute later, Gate Supervisor Daniel Harper boarded the aircraft carrying a digital tablet tucked beneath one arm. His polished uniform, silver badge, and measured stride projected confidence before he spoke a single word. Nicole met him halfway down the aisle and quietly summarized the situation while occasionally glancing toward Marcus Ellington. Daniel listened without interruption, then approached with the practiced smile of someone convinced the outcome was already settled. "Good afternoon, sir," he said. "I understand there has been some confusion regarding your assigned seat." Marcus met his eyes calmly. "There is no confusion on my end." Daniel extended his hand. "May I see your boarding pass one more time?" Marcus handed it over without hesitation. Daniel examined every line more carefully than anyone before him. For a brief second, something flickered across his expression, but it disappeared almost instantly. He returned the document. "I am afraid I am going to ask you to step into the jet bridge while we resolve this." Marcus remained where he was. "Why would I leave my assigned seat if the document in your hand confirms it?" Daniel answered with careful diplomacy. "We simply need to verify a few details." Marcus nodded once. "You have already had several opportunities to verify them." Silence settled over the surrounding rows. The businessman in row 1 leaned back with folded arms, clearly expecting Marcus to give in. Across the aisle, the elderly woman quietly removed her glasses and watched every exchange with growing concern. Emily Carter stood near the forward galley holding a tray she had completely forgotten to deliver. Her attention never left Daniel's tablet. She remembered seeing Marcus's reservation during the crew briefing earlier that afternoon. The name had appeared with an unusual notation she had never encountered before, but before she could study it, another senior attendant had closed the screen and moved on. That memory returned now with surprising clarity. She took a cautious step forward. "Supervisor Harper," she said respectfully. I think there may have been an executive designation attached during pre-flight review. Nicole turned sharply. Emily, this discussion does not involve trainees. Daniel glanced toward Emily only briefly before returning his attention to Marcus. Sir, delaying departure affects every passenger on this aircraft. Marcus looked around the cabin, making eye contact with several travelers who immediately looked away. Delays are usually caused by decisions, he replied quietly, not by questions. Several passengers exchanged thoughtful glances. A young software engineer seated in row 3 slowly lowered the tablet he had been reading and began observing the conversation instead. 2 rows behind him, a retired school principal whispered to her husband. He has been respectful the entire time. Her husband nodded, and no one seems interested in checking whether he is actually right. Nicole folded her arms more tightly. Sir, if you continue refusing our instructions, airport security will have to assist us. Marcus neither challenged nor accepted the statement. Instead, he looked through the cabin window toward the busy ramp where aircraft pushed back one after another beneath the fading afternoon sunlight. Everything outside moved with remarkable precision because every employee trusted the system to work exactly as designed. Inside this cabin, however, the system seemed to depend less on facts than on assumptions. Marcus slowly reached into his pocket once more and rested his hand around his phone without removing it. He still had not placed the call. Somewhere inside the terminal, boarding continued for dozens of Skyline Airways departures. Schedules remained perfectly on time, and executives several states away believed operations were running exactly as planned. None of them yet realized that the most important decision affecting the entire airline was unfolding quietly inside a single first-class aisle, because a handful of people had mistaken appearance for authority and confidence for deception. Emily Carter could not silence the thought that had been growing since pre-boarding. She quietly stepped back toward the forward galley where the cabin tablet still rested beside a stack of passenger manifests. Her pulse quickened as she opened the departure screen exactly the way she had been trained. The reservation list appeared row by row until she reached seat 2 Alpha. There it was again. Marcus Ellington. For less than a second, another line flashed beneath his name before the page refreshed. Executive Access Authorization. She blinked, wondering if she had imagined it. She searched again, but the notation disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Emily looked toward the aisle where Marcus still stood with remarkable composure, while Nicole Barrett continued, insisting there was a problem that somehow no one could clearly explain. Emily walked carefully towards Supervisor Daniel Harper. Sir, she said quietly enough that only he could hear. I think the reservation may include an executive designation. I saw it during pre-flight, and I just saw something similar again. Daniel barely turned his head. You are mistaken. I do not think I am. Then let information technology handle it after departure. Emily hesitated. But what if he is exactly where he belongs? Daniel's expression hardened. Return to your assigned responsibilities. Marcus noticed the exchange without hearing every word. He saw uncertainty replacing confidence on Emily's face. Doubt had entered the room, and doubt often traveled faster than certainty. Across the aisle, an elderly woman finally stood from her seat. Her name was Margaret Sullivan, a retired federal judge from Milwaukee who had spent decades watching people make conclusions before examining evidence. She looked directly at Daniel. Young man, she said calmly, I have listened for nearly 10 minutes. Has anyone actually explained what is wrong with that boarding pass? Daniel answered politely. We are following company procedures, ma'am. Margaret smiled faintly. Procedures usually begin by checking facts. A few passengers nodded in quiet agreement. Near row 3, software engineer Ethan Brooks slipped his phone into his jacket instead of recording. He has stayed respectful this entire time, he said. If the ticket is invalid, show everyone why. If it is valid, let him sit down. Another traveler, Army veteran Charles Whitmore, crossed his arms thoughtfully. Respect goes both ways, he added. I have not heard this gentleman raise his voice once. Nicole glanced around the cabin and realized the mood had shifted. What had begun as silent observation was becoming collective curiosity. The confidence she carried moments earlier slowly gave way to irritation. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, we appreciate your patience, but this matter is between our crew and this passenger. Marcus answered before anyone else could. Sometimes the way one passenger is treated becomes everyone's business. No one laughed. No one objected. The words settled over the cabin with quiet weight. Emily looked once more toward the manifest screen in the galley, unable to shake the feeling that someone had ignored information instead of verifying it. Daniel adjusted his tie and spoke into his company radio in a voice too low for passengers to understand. Within seconds, a brief reply came through his earpiece. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly before returning to Marcus. Whatever message he had received, it had not resolved the situation. Outside, another Skyline aircraft taxied past the terminal while ground crews guided vehicles with practiced precision. Inside, something much more fragile was taking shape. The cabin was no longer divided between crew and passenger. It was dividing between assumption and evidence, and with every passing minute, more witnesses were beginning to choose the side of evidence. Daniel Harper lowered his radio and drew a slow breath before speaking again. "Mr. Ellington, I am asking one final time. Please step into the jet bridge while we complete our verification." Marcus looked at him for several quiet seconds. "Verification should have happened before accusation," he replied. "Instead, accusation came first." Those words lingered across the first-class cabin with uncomfortable clarity. Nicole Barrett stepped forward, her patience visibly wearing thin. Without raising her voice, she reached toward the boarding pass still resting in Marcus's hand. "We cannot continue boarding while you refuse instructions," she said. Before Marcus could answer, she pulled the paper free. Several passengers instinctively leaned forward. Nicole looked down at the pass, shook her head dramatically, then folded it once down the center. The sound of heavy cardstock bending echoed louder than anyone expected inside the suddenly silent cabin. She placed the folded boarding pass on the nearby service counter as though it no longer mattered. Margaret Sullivan slowly stood again. "That document belonged to him," she said firmly. "You had no reason to treat it that way." Nicole avoided her eyes. "The reservation is under review." Charles Whitmore spoke next. "Reviewing something is different from dismissing someone." Even Brian Collins appeared less certain than before. He looked from the folded boarding pass to Daniel, silently waiting for reassurance that never came. Marcus remained remarkably composed. He glanced briefly at the paper resting on the counter before looking through the aircraft window. The reflection staring back reminded him of another airport decades earlier. He was 23 years old, carrying the only suit he owned after spending nearly every dollar attending a business conference in Dallas. A gate agent had looked at his inexpensive luggage, then quietly suggested he move aside while actual business travelers boarded first. He had obeyed without argument because he believed success would eventually erase assumptions. Standing in this cabin years later, after building companies that employed thousands across the country, he realized assumptions simply changed uniforms. They rarely disappeared on their own. The memory faded as quickly as it arrived. Marcus returned his attention to the present. "Interesting," he said softly. "Some people believe dignity depends on a seat assignment." Daniel answered carefully. "This is not about dignity." Marcus nodded. "You are right. It stopped being about a seat several minutes ago." Emily Carter watched every exchange with growing concern. She quietly reopened the electronic manifest on the galley tablet one final time. Again the reservation appeared. Again, for only an instant, the hidden notation flashed beneath Marcus Ellington's name before disappearing. This time she noticed something else. A small internal reference number remained visible after the designation vanished. She quickly memorized it before the screen refreshed. Whatever that number represented, it was important enough to be concealed behind restricted access. Emily looked toward Daniel, considering whether to speak again, but stopped herself. She sensed the situation had already crossed a line where ordinary explanations would no longer matter. Around the cabin, conversations had completely disappeared. No one reached for headphones. No one opened a laptop. Even passengers who had initially sided with the crew now seemed unsure. The tension no longer came from disagreement. It came from the unsettling feeling that everyone was watching a mistake grow larger simply because no one in authority wanted to admit the first mistake had already been made. Marcus slowly reached into his pocket once more. This time he removed his phone and unlocked the screen without hesitation. His thumb rested over a single contact that had remained untouched since boarding began. He looked once around the cabin, meeting the eyes of Emily, Margaret, Charles, Ethan, and finally Daniel. There was no anger in his expression, only quiet certainty. The room had revealed everything it intended to reveal. There was nothing left to observe. It was finally time to make the call. Marcus Ellington touched the contact once. The phone rang only a single time before a calm, professional voice answered. Rachel Lawson speaking. Marcus never raised his voice. Rachel, initiate Executive Flight Protocol 7. There was no surprise on the other end. Confirmed, sir. Level 7 authorization requires immediate operational review. Shall I include legal, executive operations, network control, and corporate compliance? Marcus looked out the cabin window where another Skyline Airways aircraft had just begun pushing back from its gate. Include everyone. Freeze all departures connected to executive security review until I personally release the network. Rachel answered without hesitation. Authorization accepted. Your biometric confirmation has been verified. The protocol is now active. Marcus ended the call and quietly placed the phone back into his pocket. No dramatic announcement followed. No one inside the cabin understood what those few sentences actually meant. Nicole Barrett folded her arms with a faint smile. Finished calling your lawyer? She asked. Marcus looked at her with the same steady composure he had maintained from the moment he stepped aboard. No, he replied. I called the people responsible for protecting this airline. Brian Collins exchanged a puzzled glance with Daniel Harper, who remained convinced the situation would soon resolve itself. Sir, Daniel said, if that call was intended to pressure our crew, it will not change company policy. Marcus answered quietly. Policy exists to protect people. It was never meant to protect assumptions. Emily Carter watched Marcus carefully. Something about the conversation felt completely different now. He was no longer waiting. His patience had transformed into certainty. She glanced toward the cabin clock mounted near the forward galley. Barely 30 seconds had passed since the call ended. Thousands of miles away in Skyline Airways' Global Operations Center outside Atlanta, computer monitors changed color almost simultaneously. Executive authorization banners appeared across secure terminals. Network supervisors stopped speaking mid-sentence as priority alerts replaced ordinary scheduling screens. A message marked immediate executive action required acknowledgement before any other function could continue. Inside corporate legal, attorneys canceled meetings as encrypted notifications appeared on their devices. Executive operations redirected every available manager toward the developing situation. Compliance officers began downloading gate communications, passenger records, boarding logs, and employee access histories connected to Flight 217. Nobody questioned the instruction because only one person inside the company possessed authority to activate Protocol 7 without board approval. Back inside the aircraft, nothing outwardly seemed different. Passengers remained seated. Overhead bins stayed open. Flight attendants continued preparing for departure, unaware that an invisible current had already begun flowing through every layer of the organization. Ethan Brooks checked his watch. This is taking longer than it should, he whispered. Margaret Sullivan answered softly. Sometimes the most important decisions are made where nobody can see them. Charles Whitmore nodded without taking his eyes off Marcus. Emily suddenly heard a notification tone from the galley tablet. She looked down instinctively. A red banner stretched across the screen before disappearing almost immediately. Operational hold pending executive review. Her eyes widened. She refreshed the display, but the message was gone. She had not imagined it. Daniel's company radio crackled unexpectedly. He pressed the receiver against his ear, expecting routine boarding instructions. Instead, the voice on the other end sounded unusually tense. Supervisor Harper, remain at gate C12. Do not close the aircraft door until further notice. Additional instructions are being transmitted. Daniel frowned. Reason? A brief pause followed before the reply came back. Executive authorization. Stand by. Daniel slowly lowered the radio. For the first time since boarding began, uncertainty replaced confidence in his expression. Marcus remained exactly where he had been all along, standing beside seat 2 Alpha with relaxed shoulders and quiet eyes. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply waited as the first small ripple from one comm phone call began spreading far beyond the walls of a single airplane. Daniel Harper stared at the radio in his hand as though it had suddenly begun speaking a different language. Before he could ask another question, Every device carried by the flight crew chimed within seconds of one another. Nicole Barrett looked down at her company tablet. The departure countdown that had been visible only moments earlier vanished. In its place appeared a single red banner. Operational hold. Await executive authorization. She refreshed the screen once. Then again. The message refused to disappear. Brian Collins frowned and checked his own device. The same warning filled his display. That has to be a system error, he muttered, more to reassure himself than anyone else. Emily Carter quietly looked toward Marcus Ellington. He had not moved. He had not spoken. Yet the atmosphere around him felt entirely different now, as though the room itself had begun catching up with something he had understood all along. Outside the aircraft window, the pushback tug connected to the airplane across the ramp suddenly stopped moving. Ground crew members exchanged puzzled looks before speaking into their headsets. Another Skyline aircraft waiting several gates away remained perfectly still despite its boarding door already being closed. On the terminal concourse, departure screens flickered. One flight changed from on time to hold. Then another. Within moments, the pattern spread across the board like falling dominoes. Travelers stopped walking long enough to stare upward as more departure times disappeared beneath identical operational notices. Hundreds of miles away, dispatch specialists watched route maps fill with yellow markers representing aircraft no longer cleared to depart. Inside network control, supervisors abandoned routine scheduling discussions and gathered around the central operations wall. Every available manager had been summoned. The words Executive Flight Protocol 7 appeared across the largest monitor in the room. Nobody questioned its legitimacy because the digital authorization carried the highest executive security signature available inside the company. Back at gate C12, Daniel's radio crackled again, this time with unmistakable urgency. Supervisor Harper confirmed that Flight 217 remains at the gate. Confirmed, Daniel answered. Maintain current position. Senior Executive Response Team is en route. No passengers are to deplane or depart until further instruction. Daniel's eyes widened. Is this connected to the operational hold? A brief silence followed before the reply came. Everything is connected to the operational hold. Nicole's confidence began slipping away. She looked toward Marcus with visible uncertainty. Who exactly did you call? Marcus answered with the same calm voice that had never changed from the beginning. Someone who believes procedures should begin with facts. Margaret Sullivan slowly smiled without saying a word. Ethan Brooks opened the airline application on his phone and refreshed the live flight map. His eyebrows lifted. This cannot be right, he whispered. Charles Whitmore leaned closer. What are you seeing? Ethan turned the screen so those nearest him could read it. Skyline departures across multiple airports were shifting into temporary hold status one after another. This is bigger than this airplane, he said quietly. Emily felt a chill run through her despite the cool cabin air. She remembered the hidden executive notation flashing beneath Marcus's reservation and suddenly understood that it had never been an ordinary passenger record. Brian looked at Daniel, waiting for direction, but Daniel no longer seemed certain he was the one giving orders. Marcus finally broke the silence with a single sentence spoken so evenly that it carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. You believed you were protecting first class, he said. You never stopped to ask who was protecting the airline. At that exact moment, another notification appeared across every crew device. Estimated network revenue exposure, $2.1 billion. Operational review continues. No one inside the cabin spoke. The realization settled over them all at once. Whatever had just begun was no longer a disagreement over one passenger or one seat. It had become a decision capable of reaching every corner of the airline before a single airplane left the ground. The silence inside the cabin lasted only a few seconds before the outside world began catching up with what had already happened. Through the wide first-class windows, flashing amber lights appeared beside several nearby gates as airport operations teams redirected ground traffic away from departing aircraft. Fuel trucks paused where they stood. Pushback tractors disconnected from airplanes that had been cleared only moments earlier. Across the terminal, electronic departure boards continued changing line after line until nearly every Skyline Airways flight displayed the same message. Operational hold. Please await further updates. Passengers inside the cabin instinctively reached for their phones. News alerts had not appeared yet, but the airline application already reflected an expanding wave of delays stretching from Chicago to Dallas, Atlanta, Denver, Seattle, Phoenix, Boston, Miami, and Los Angeles. Ethan Brooks refreshed the live map again. The number continued climbing. "It is spreading," he whispered. Charles Whitmore slowly exhaled. That call reached the entire network. Daniel Harper's company radio came alive again, this time carrying several overlapping voices instead of one comm dispatcher. "Supervisor Harper, remain available for direct executive communication." Another voice interrupted before he could answer. "Corporate compliance has secured all boarding records. Preserve every device currently assigned to Gate Charlie 12. A third message followed almost immediately. "Regional Vice President is 5 minutes away." Daniel lowered the radio without saying a word. For the first time in years, experience offered him no guidance because nothing in his career had prepared him for an executive response of this scale. Nicole Barrett unlocked her tablet once more, hoping the operational warning had disappeared. Instead, a new notification replaced it. "Employee system access restricted pending administrative review." She stared at the screen before trying again. The same message appeared. Brian Collins attempted to access the passenger manifest, but his login credentials were rejected. He entered them again more carefully. "Access denied." Emily Carter quietly checked her trainee account. Hers still worked. She suddenly understood why. No one had questioned her honesty. Margaret Sullivan folded her hands and looked toward Marcus. "You knew this would happen," she said gently. Marcus answered with quiet honesty. "I knew accountability would happen. The scale depends on how deeply the problem reaches." At that moment, the aircraft door opened once again. This time, no ordinary supervisor stepped aboard. 3 senior executives entered the cabin wearing skyline identification badges that displayed corporate headquarters rather than airport operations. They moved with urgency, but without panic, scanning the cabin before immediately recognizing Marcus. The oldest executive, Chief Operations Officer Linda Brooks, stopped several feet away. Without hesitation, she offered a respectful nod. "Mr. Ellington," she said, "thank you for remaining here while we responded." Every passenger in first class fell completely silent. Nicole looked from Linda to Marcus as though trying to reconcile 2 completely different realities. Daniel's face lost all remaining color. Brian slowly lowered his tablet. Emily simply closed her eyes for a brief moment because everything she had suspected since pre-boarding had just been confirmed. Linda continued speaking. "Executive Operations has frozen 152 departures under Protocol 7. Corporate Legal has secured all communication records. Compliance has begun a full review of today's decisions. Estimated network revenue exposure currently exceeds $2.1 billion, but preserving the integrity of this airline takes priority over immediate departures." Nobody challenged her. Nobody even breathed loudly enough to interrupt. Marcus finally looked around the cabin, not with satisfaction, but with quiet disappointment. The passengers who had defended him earlier lowered their eyes respectfully, while those who had dismissed him seemed unable to meet his gaze. The balance of power had changed completely, not because Marcus had demanded respect, but because the truth had finally entered the room, and once it arrived, every assumption that had filled the cabin only minutes before quietly collapsed beneath its weight. Marcus Ellington accepted the respectful greeting from Chief Operations Officer Linda Brooks with a slight nod, then looked around the first-class cabin one final time. No one interrupted the silence because no one needed an explanation anymore. The truth had already spoken for itself. Linda carefully picked up the folded boarding pass from the service counter and smoothed it with both hands before offering it back to Marcus. "Your seat is ready, sir," she said quietly. Marcus accepted the pass without looking at it. Instead, his attention rested on Nicole Barrett, Brian Collins, and Daniel Harper. None of them appeared angry anymore. They looked overwhelmed by the realization that a decision lasting only a few minutes had reached every corner of the company they represented. Daniel finally stepped forward. "Mr. Ellington," he said carefully, "I owe you an apology. I should have verified the facts before accepting assumptions." Marcus listened without interrupting. Nicole lowered her eyes. "I judged you before I knew anything about you," she admitted. "There is no excuse for that." Brian nodded in agreement. "We were so focused on protecting the image of first class that we forgot the purpose of serving every passenger with respect." Marcus remained silent for a moment before answering. This was never about whether I could sit in seat 2 Alpha. I could have purchased every seat on this airplane if I wanted to. The real question was whether someone without influence, without recognition, or without resources would have received fairness today. No one answered because everyone already knew the answer. Emily Carter quietly stepped forward from the galley. Marcus smiled warmly for the first time that afternoon. Thank you for asking questions when it would have been easier to stay quiet. Emily shook her head modestly. I only followed what I believed was right. Marcus replied, that is how real leadership begins. Margaret Sullivan smiled from across the aisle. Charles Whitmore gave a respectful nod. Ethan Brooks slipped his phone back into his pocket, deciding there was no reason to record what integrity already made unforgettable. Linda received another message on her tablet before speaking once more. Executive Operations has completed the initial review. The network hold will now be lifted in phases. Flights will resume safely under updated authorization. Administrative decisions regarding today's conduct will follow company policy and a full compliance investigation. Marcus nodded. Accountability, not humiliation, had always been the objective. He turned toward the passengers gathered throughout the cabin. Success does not always wear an expensive suit, he said calmly. Leadership does not always announce itself when it enters a room. And dignity should never depend on whether someone recognizes your title. His words settled gently across the cabin, replacing the tension that had filled it only minutes earlier. Outside the aircraft windows, pushback tractors returned to position. Departure boards across the country slowly changed from operational holdback to boarding and on time. The airline began moving again, but not quite the same way it had before. Inside the cabin, Marcus finally placed his carry-on into the overhead bin and took his seat beside the window. The aircraft door closed moments later, not because authority demanded it, but because fairness had finally caught up with procedure. As the airplane eased away from the gate, the afternoon sunlight reflected across the wing, and Marcus looked out over the busy runway with quiet gratitude. He had not raised his voice once. He had simply raised the standard. And somewhere across 152 flights, thousands of employees would soon learn the same lesson that everyone inside this cabin would remember for years to come. The most valuable seat on any airplane is not first class. It is the place where every person is treated with equal respect before anyone knows who they are.